Welcome to the program, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Justin Peters. I hope that you and your family are doing well today. I want to thank you for joining me. This is the second of a three-part series on Jim Osmond's new book, God Doesn't Whisper. And Jim, in our first installment, we were just giving an overview of the book, the subject matter at hand, how God does and does not speak to us today. And in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the assumptions that people have, specifically that I need to hear the voice of God. I should expect to hear the voice of God, and there is a way for me to learn how to hear the voice of God. And then we're going to talk about some of the practices like a still small voice and, a verse jumped off the page as I was reading the Bible, those kinds of things. So let's begin with the assumptions that, first of all, the assumption among most evangelicals, almost all, is I need to hear the voice of God.
Yeah, that's the first assumption. In fact, I deal with three of them in the book. First, I need to hear the voice of God outside Scripture. I should expect to hear it because Jesus has promised it in John 10:27, my sheep hear my voice. And so many evangelicals take that as a promise that God has promised to speak to us. And if you're not, as we talked about in the last episode, if you're not hearing those whispers and he's not speaking to you, then maybe you're not his sheep, or maybe there's something wrong with your relationship. So that's the assumption that goes behind some of their assertions that God is speaking to us in whispers, nudgings, and promptings. And then the third assumption is that I can learn to hear the voice of God outside of Scripture. So the first one is that I need to hear the voice of God outside Scripture. So basically the argument that HVG teachers make is that life is filled with all kinds of decisions that we have to make. Decisions about which house to buy, which college to attend, which church should I go to, which ministry should I give to, how much should I give, who should I marry, what job should I take, all of us, what city should I live in. Life is filled with thousands of decisions, many of them, maybe even thousands of which we make each and every day. And so they would say that we can't possibly be obedient to God in making all of these decisions unless we're following God's individual and specific will and revelation in each one of these decisions. So if we can't be, if I run the risk of being disobedient to God in choosing which church to attend, or which college to attend, or which ministry to support, if I run the risk of being disobedient, then I need to wait for God to reveal specifically to me which decision I'm supposed to make, what I am supposed to do in a given situation, and that I need to, this is the assumption, be quiet, listen, still myself, still my heart, and wait to hear the voice of God before I make any decision. So Henry Blackaby, for instance, in his book, Experiencing God, says that church leaders and Christians need to wait, slow down, wait, and listen for God to reveal those things, and not take any action until we have some clear direction from God about which direction we should go, which decision we should make. Because if we jump out and we do something without God revealing it to us, we might jump out in disobedience and do something that God would not have us to do. Right. So instead, we should be quiet, and we can't make those decisions, and we can't move forward in life without God revealing those. And so that's the assumption. And then, of course, the follow-up to that is if that's what God has promised to give to us, if that's what we need to hear from God, then how do we do that? They would look at the Old Testament prophets. They would look at all the ways that God spoke in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they would say that these become models then for how we are to hear the voice of God today. So Moses needed to hear the voice of God, Samuel needed to hear the voice of God, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, David, Solomon, all of these men were guided by God's specific direction for their lives, and they become models for us by which we are able to hear the voice of God, because as Charles Stanley would say in his book, How to Listen to God, we need that personal direction just as much as any of the Old Testament prophets or the apostles needed that personal direction. We can't get along without it. Robert Morrison talks about how he can't pastor a church. He wouldn't know how to pastor a church. He wouldn't be able to pastor a church obediently to God if he didn't have the nudgings, the promptings, and God whispering in his ear specific directions in how to pastor a church. So that's the assumption, that we need this. This is something that we need outside of Scripture. That Scripture, and again, we come back to the sufficiency of Scripture, the Scripture is not enough. God has not, this is the assumption behind that, is that God has not provided everything we need for life and godliness.
Yeah. Okay. So I expect, and learn how to hear it.
Yeah, the expect one, the second assumption, and I devote a chapter to each one of these assumptions. And I show in the book how these HVG teachers, Charles Stanley, Priscilla Schreier, Beth Moore, etc., how they make this case that we need to, that we should expect to, and that we can learn to hear the voice of God. I should expect to hear the voice of God, that assumption, that comes down to we are promised in Scripture that God is going to speak to us. This is what they teach. They would say that John 10:27, my sheep hear my voice. That's Jesus' promise that if you belong to him, he will speak to you. Priscilla Schreier, in one of her books on hearing the voice of God, and she has a prolific amount of material on the subject. One of her books, she says, this is God's promise to you, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. As sure, I think she says, as sure as the chair that I'm sitting in, I know that God will speak to you because he has promised to do so. And so in that chapter, I deal with that passage, particularly John 10. Is that really a promise from Jesus that he will speak to his people, his sheep? Yeah. In the sense of what they're describing, the whispers, impressions, nudgings from heaven for day-to-day decision-making.
Yeah. And so let's talk about John 10:27 a little bit. It seems very clear. Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice. So is that not saying that we are Christians, we are sheep, and so should we not be hearing the voice of the shepherd?
Yeah, and the context is key there, because you will hear HVG teachers quote that verse always without explaining the context.
So John 10:27 to me is the most concise and comprehensive verse in Scripture about hearing God. It is when Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me.
In fact, for most Christians who would quote that verse and say, yeah, I hear from God because Jesus promised the sheep would hear his voice, I would bet you that 99 out of 100 of them could not tell you what context that is in or what Jesus is dealing with in the context. If you just said to them, exegete for me the context or explain the context, they wouldn't have a clue what Jesus is talking about. They would say, well, he's just talking about his sheep hearing his voice, isn't he? Well, he is, but John says in that chapter, John chapter 10, that Jesus was using a figure of speech.